Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. On the program, I have two brilliant women who are strong, radical, anti-colonialists, and advocates for their people, and I'm hoping to build a bridge and do some solidarity coalition building or inspire that for anyone who is a viewer and cares about the topics which are dear to my heart, such as radical justice for Indigenous people on Turtle Island, Hawaii, Alaska, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders of Australia, the Maori of New Zealand, and the Sami people of Scandinavia, and similar Indigenous nations brutally colonized and marginalized, and Pan-Africanism from Turtle Island to the ongoing Commonwealth in Africa itself. So without further ado, this program is going to also do some much needed myth busting on Indigenous history and misconceptions other colonized and racially marginalized people have towards the first Americans and Indigenous nations. So with me today is our returning champion, Elaina Porter of the Pendo Center for Self-Determination and Human Rights. Pendo is very much following the tradition of radical Black nationalism and the campaigns and school of thought of Paul Robeson when he campaigned for the We Charge Genocide campaign, trying to bring the plights of the Black diaspora and descendants of slaves to an international audience at the UN so justice could be served and to build global solidarity. And Pendo, they are also students of the Malcolm X School of Thought on self-determination and Malcolm's efforts to also carry on the work of Robeson and what Robeson and his comrades did with We Charge Genocide to get, international heads of states and others to take up the plight of Black people in the US to the UN. And my other guest is a brilliant educator, activist, mythbuster, truth teller, and all-around extraordinary woman by the name Sharon Smith. And Ms. Smith is an Indigenous person of the Saponi, Pamunkey, sorry if I'm butchering the name, you can correct me, and Mohawk from her father's side. And she is a Black woman, an Afro-Indigenous woman, and her mother was of New England Quaker, English, Scotch, Irish, Welsh, Spanish. So ladies, first of all, thank you for joining me today and for honoring me today by coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's
Saponi, Pamunkey, Mohawk, and African American. Yes.
Okay. So actually, so let me just get that right before I get to the question. So Saponi, Pow, right. and then Pow.
Pamunkey is one of the Powhatan tribes. In Virginia, the coastal Algonquin people, who Pocahontas was Pamunkey and Mattaponi. Okay. Father was Pamunkey, her mother was Mattaponi.
Yeah, and
the Saponi are Eastern. Mohawk from New York State, yes. And my father's father was Mohawk. My father's mother was Pamunkey and Saponi from Virginia. Saponi are Eastern Siouan people, distantly related to the Lakota, Dakota folks out on the plains. We're more culturally Southern than Plains. And many of us, Saponi are not recognized by the federal government, and only a couple of bands of Saponi are recognized by the state of North Carolina, although our homeland ranges from Northern Virginia all the way through the Carolinas, and going west from the East Coast all the way into Kentucky and Tennessee.
Wow, that is.
But we no longer exist as a people according to the federal government.
Well, F the federal government. So, I mean,
so that's
Turtle Island,
right?
Turtle Island always was, always will be Indigenous land, as as my comrades in Australia would say. But alrighty, so.
And so I'm speaking to you from the Paul Cuffey Abolitionist Center in the Eastern Siouan Territory, Catawba land in South Carolina.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much for that. And now before I get to my questions, now Elaina, you were the one that inspired me to have this conversation. So you're going to get to ask your $2 million questions, and yeah, your $2 million questions, and you can also fit in a third one, if you'd like. But now I really wanted to have this this conversation and invite an Indigenous person, and we're lucky that we have not just an Indigenous woman, but an Afro-Indigenous person. So wanted to have this conversation with you because the first the first time I ever interviewed you, when you talked to me about radical self-determination for Afro-Descendants and so forth, you sold me on the idea, and my second to last question was how would Latinx, but more importantly Indigenous people, fare in this kind of new America that you want to create, which I guess would be dominated mostly by or led by Afro-descendant people. And I asked you, how would Indigenous people fare, being that Turtle Island, this is all their lands, they're minorities in their own countries, they're also brutally suppressed by the white supremacist regime, settler colonialism. And you said to me that that if such a Black nation was to be formed, these sort of city states or an entire nation, you said that you would welcome the Latinx people, the Puerto Ricans, Indigenous people of Turtle Island with open arms, because we all share the same oppression. But you mentioned that that there were that there were some Native Americans that had slaves of Afro-descendants. So yes. If we want to talk about reparations, you said that would have to be part of a conversation. And some of my Indigenous biracial Indigenous friends and others who are involved in solidarity work with Indigenous people in Canada and the United States, they said that they took issue, that was the only thing that they took issue when when we did that first interview. And of course the second interview we did very recently, you mentioned about how you still mentioned that that's an issue, that's an issue for you. And then we kind of got into a polite disagreement about because I said if America was a racial caste system, the Indigenous people have it worse compared to Latinx, Black diaspora folks, and immigrants, legal or otherwise, the queer community and so forth.
Oh yeah, and I stand by those words. I'm very clear on who enslaved Blacks here in the United States. In the South.
All right. So that being said, that's a perfect segue to the first. Yeah. So
you should be the person to re-ask the questions, because I don't have any questions. I will only be reaffirming my responses to your concerns.
Okay. Then. All right. Then. Okay. Then. Okay, then let me let me start this. So okay, so we've already sort of established that. So then Miss Smith, do you want to clarify this this sort of controversy about some Indigenous tribes that had slaves, and demystify that, myth bust for that if you'd like, or explain the context to Elaina and your response to Elaina's two past comments when Indigenous people were brought up when I interviewed her last time and the first time.
So I wasn't there when you interviewed Elaina twice before, and I'm not sure what your question is, because you need to breathe.
Yes, he does. Can I reiterate what I stated?
Yeah.
Sure.
And if you go back and look at his last two interviews, you will see the context in which I was responding.
Yeah.
One of his questions were, because I explained to him that we were going to be exercising our right to self-determination using the Confederated Tribal Nation as a political configuration, so we could have a way to transfer our wealth, power, and resources back to U.S. Afro-Descendants. Voting have left us no more than a mob. We don't have the protections as Native Americans. We were afforded certain protections by the federal government after 1865, but those protections were rescinded after President Abraham Lincoln was murdered. They were rescinded and we were re-enslaved. So my position is we were annexed to this polity without our consent. Our ancestors did not consent to being assimilated into the United States government, and we do not consent to it now. Now, by us being in the political status as a simple minority, our resources are absorbed and misappropriated to all other immigrant groups who come here. Not to say that we don't want to share. We would love to share with them. If they're in our areas, we're not going to take anything from them. However, our resources are already meager. We don't have a way to make any goods that we depend on. We don't have any institutions that we control. The Native Americans are able to control their institutions, their policing. In some areas you are. In some areas you are able to control that. We're not, with that political status that we're in.
I agree with everything you said, except for that last bit about Native Americans are able to control their destinies, their lands, etc. Because
do you all not control your own policing in some areas?
Let me give the nuance to this that it needs. Those tribes who are federally recognized are dependent nations, and the U.S. acts as a fiduciary trustee to all of what happens in their territories. So yes, there's tribal police, but there was a recent lawsuit about that because tribal courts and tribal police cannot address crimes in Indian territories or on reservations committed by non-tribal people. So rapists can come in, violent criminals can come in and do horrendous things to the population of the reservation, and the tribal police and courts have no jurisdiction over those people. They only have jurisdiction over their own folks. And that's the way that works. So with the horrible problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is, disproportionate to the rest of the population, including the Black population, which also has horrific numbers of missing and murdered Black women and girls. They could not, up until recently, address that issue in their courts and with their police officers. So they do not have control. And they surely cannot go outside of whatever their designated jurisdiction is in order to deal with encroachers and people committing crimes in their territories. So no, they do not have control.
But you do have your own, excuse me, Yuri, but you do have your own policing. We can agree on that.
Some communities do, not all do. In some Native communities, the FBI is the go-to place or agency. So that's not true for everybody across the board. And as I said, that only is about federally recognized tribes, which is a small subset of all the Indigenous people. Not everybody has a land base. Some people have none, like the Saponi. There's no designated land base for the Saponi because we were written out of existence in 1730 by a colonial governor in Virginia. We're still here, but we're not recognized as existing anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So
Then
how do you have a police force for that group or the state recognized tribes? They don't have that kind of a setup either. So, I mean, so it's incorrect to say that Native people have control over policing in their communities because there are plenty of Native folk that don't have communities, so to speak.
and can you answer?
I'll agree to disagree.
Okay, all right.
Uh,
You know, I mean, if we're going to talk about Native communities, we're going to have to talk about all of us, not just the folks that are federally recognized.
That's true. I agree.
There are a whole bunches of us. I mean, and most of us are, you know, in some provisional category of either state recognized or reclassified as something other than Native, such as Latino or what you call Latinx. Those, you know, scratch a Latino and you get a Native. I mean, you know, there's very few of them that are actually white.
That's true.
Some are.
then
That's true.
So you know, we could talk about the Native identity issue later, but to your point, Natives do not have control over policing in their communities.
but
Not
then
all.
Natives do not have control over policing in their communities.
and
They have a limited, let's say it's limited control.
Now, okay,
Okay, then,
I'll agree with that.
okay, then Miss Smith, can you then answer, you know, this historical allegation that you know that Elaina talked to me about of Native Americans you know holding Native Americans holding slaves and yeah, you know, explain that and the context. Yeah, just
Yeah, so yes, there were some Native groups that engaged in the slave trade. And there has always been some kind of, I wouldn't call it slavery per se, prior to European contact. It was more like war captives who most often were adopted into families to replace people who they lost. But after European contact, just like in Africa, there were pressures put upon the local indigenous populations, most of it having to do with trade. So in order to protect themselves from rival groups, there were a handful, like literally five tribes that engaged in the slave trade with European colonists in exchange for guns, ammunition, and European trade goods. The rest of the Native folk, like over 500 nations and confederacies and tribes in the Americas, 5 out of over 500, the rest were busy trying to figure out how to avoid slavery themselves. Because a part of the story about Native American slavery is that Natives were enslaved too. Before Africans were brought here as slaves, Natives were the slaves. And the same Natives continued to be slaves after their racial designation was, after they were reclassified in the record books as Black or Negro or mulatto or whatever. Those same people were still enslaved along with the quote unquote Black population. So, you know, there's a deeper history that we need to go into when we say that natives engaged in the slave trade.
I think
I agree. And I believe I clarified to Brother Yuri that not all Native Americans participated in the slave trade. However, in my area, I know for a fact that the Cherokee engaged in slavery. And not only did they engage in slavery, they refused to even share some of the reparations that they got from the United States government. As a matter of fact, in 2007, they kicked their Black natives out. That's fact.
Yeah. But okay. So there are two things going on here. One is, yes, the Cherokees did engage in the slave trade. They were one of the biggest of the 5 quote unquote civilized tribes. And they were called civilized because they engaged in the slave trade, and they were more interested in assimilating into the colonial white culture than they were in maintaining their own cultural distinctiveness. That's the first point. The second point is, talk more about Cherokees getting reparations.
Oh yes, they got reparations because the United States misappropriated some of their finances and didn't actually hold their end of some of the agreements that they had. I'm not very familiar with it, but I do know.
Do you know that it was the Cherokees were involved in that? Because
the links that Yuri,
the links that Yuri sent me were about the Cobell case.
Oh, the Cobalt case. And there was a case.
And I don't know that the Cherokees were involved in that. I'm not.
Was that the case from Oklahoma?
No,
yes.
that's the Cherokee. But I wish you had sent me that 2 days ago, because the articles I sent to Ms. Smith was the CNN one about Obama apparently giving reparations.
Oh yes.
And Black News saying that some some Afro-Indigenous folk were excluded from some reparation settlements. And me and Ms. Smith wanted to read the New York Times one, but it's behind a paywall. So.
Oh, okay. Well, the next time I'll make sure I do a little bit better research. So when I call names, I'll call the correct names and name those tribes who actually had slaves.
Well, there were
Black
5. There were only 5.
Yeah.
That enslaved Black
and
Americans.
their southeastern tribes, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Creek. There's somebody else, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. I just want you to know that that was primarily a southeastern thing during the early colonial period. Once the colonists began to move west across the Appalachian Mountains, the whole history and culture and everything else and the nature of colonialism shifted to something else. They weren't interested in enslaving natives anymore. But so the southeastern story, actually it's more than that. It's the entire East Coast, because what does it say in this book, the Indian slave trade? Wait a minute, there's a quote. They 1641, Massachusetts Bay passed the first slave law in the English Atlantic world, in large part because authorities wanted to define the legal status of hundreds of Pequot Indian captives they had incorporated into their households. So the first slave law, 1641, was in Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it was about Indian slavery. I mean, the early colonies financed their economic development in the colonies by selling indigenous people into slavery. That's, and those tribes were not into the slave trade. They were not selling each other. But when we got to the Southeast, there's another book, The Indian Slave Trade in the Rise of the English Empire in the American South, 1670 to 1717, by Alan Gallay. we see more of a picture of what was going on in Africa, where tribes were pit against one another and encouraged to sell their captives to the English, who also enslaved those people, but also sold them to all kinds of places in order to develop the economic engine of the Southern colonies, particularly the Carolinas and Virginia. I mean, this is the early colonial history. Early on, it was not cost effective to bring African captives over as much as it was to enslave the indigenous Americans, because the Portuguese and the Spanish controlled the Atlantic slave trade.
Yes.
But after the Spanish Armada, you know, where the English beat the Spanish and the Portuguese at sea, then it became more cost effective to bring in African captives. And at that point, you know, there were native captives that were sold and exchanged for African captives.
Mm-hmm.
So the native slavery never ended. And a lot of times, you know, people were in the Southeast, between the one drop rule and the blood quantum requirements, whole families were written out of existence as indigenous and become Black or Negro,
Mm-hmm.
or mulatto. I mean, that's part of the history. And those folks were not engaged in the Indian slave trade. They were the slaves.
And just to clarify something, the Black diaspora who were enslaved by the five indigenous tribes, they weren't brutal to their subjects like, say, the Middle Eastern slave or the white colonialists were towards chattel slavery.
Well, I don't know that that's true.
Totally disagree with that.
I think, yeah, I disagree
that doesn't
too.
hold water.
Right, exactly. I agree with Elaina on that. It all depends on the tribe, too. And the Cherokee were so interested in assimilating into white colonial culture that they were
Which
just
didn't do them
brutal.
any good in the long term.
Well, no, but if you go to Western North Carolina now, you'll see, this goes back to that Indian identity issue that, we're going to have to discuss. Most of them are white. Most of them are Republican. Yeah, I've met some of them up there in Western North Carolina and Tennessee. They have blonde hair, blue-eyed, red-headed, green-eyed Cherokees running around in the hills in Tennessee. And the Cherokees fought on the side of the Confederacy in the Civil War. They even have their own Cherokee Confederate battle flag that they are very proud of. And the chairman at Western North Carolina Cherokees has one in his office that he proudly displays to anybody coming in there.
But I've read Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who I've been trying to get on the show for for years. I read her book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, and what I was shocked about reading this this book, in which I had to binge read it a lot because I was so depressed reading the crimes against humanity white America has done towards indigenous people. But I was shocked when reading the book how much the whole divide and conquer thing that that settler colonialists, that imperialists did to Native Americans, and how you had some Native Americans who thought, okay, the video is going to end in no time, so make sure to both give me your Skype so we can continue this conversation. But anyways, I was shocked by how by the divide and conquer, where some Native Americans were on the side of Abraham Lincoln, even though he continued the dispossession, and others were on the side of the Confederacy because they didn't trust the Yankees and stuff like that. Is that true?
I'm not sure I got all that. I'm trying to figure out how to give you my Skype. I don't know what that means. I have a Skype account, which I have never used.
Yes.
So what do I do?
Give me your Skype account if it's about to cut us off, and we'll continue the conversation from there.
Well, how do I give you my Skype account?
Email it to me or Facebook it to me.
Okay, well, I don't even know where it is at this point because I've never used it.
Jesus Christ. This is not my day on on Zoom and whatnot.
So I don't know what to tell you. Couldn't we?
I mean, are we using your Zoom or the same Zoom that I set up?
My Zoom.
Well, do you want try to go
I mean,
back
we could
into
go
the
into
Zoom?
Elena's Zoom or, do another Zoom link because I don't even know how to use Skype.
Yeah. We can do that too. And if Elaina and if you put it on your YouTube, I can easily, find a way to download it and upload it.
Well, I can download it and email it to you, can I?
You can try. It might be difficult, but it's possible. So,
Okay.
but until then, let's continue on with the conversation right now. All right, but anyways, yeah. So what I was saying, Ms. Smith, was that I was shocked by how much divide and conquer was done to the indigenous people, and from what I've read, some indigenous people simply did not trust Abraham Lincoln and the Union because they knew that he was going to continue manifest destiny. Hence why some either remained neutral or chose to fight on the side of the Confederacy.
No, I don't buy it. I don't buy that. I mean, because the people who fought on the side of the Confederacy were the natives that were involved in the slave trade.
Okay. All right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, a little bit.
And the justification they gave was that the Confederacy promised to give them more autonomy over their territories.
Yes.
That's the justification I have heard.
Yeah, well, I think Ms. Dunbar Ortiz.
But then Andrew Jackson came along and removed them all from the Southeast.
But then
those that stayed were either classified as white or black.
Yep, mostly black, and some of them were re-enslaved.
Exactly.
Then,
and that doesn't even begin to talk about how, Black people are indigenous to the Americas to begin with. So that's a whole other topic.
It is.
But then,
Smith, I think you're going to have to teach a whole series on the Black American, because they're just based off the research that I have done in my area concerning the Native Americans of the South. It appears to me that what happened once the settlers got here was they set up a binary social construct. If you look like them, they welcome you into their militias and into engaging in trade and trapping furs, this, that, and the other. But if you were of a darker hue, you were either, your rights were either encroached on subtly in increments, and you were pushed to this construct of being Black. Am I correct in my observation, or am I wrong?
Well, you are correct in that the European colonizers created the racial construct and decided who fit in which categories. The details vary depending on, what time in history you're in and which people we're talking about and the geography. But that's essentially true. And what I know about the peopling of the Southeast and the South in general, from Florida all the way across to Louisiana, and I guess parts of California too. I mean, there were Black people here long before European colonization. And then the colonists came in and created their racial purity paradigm. And
the blood
decided
quantum and stuff like that, right?
the blood quantum and the one drop nonsense.
And that
But
1924
that didn't come
thing.
about yet. But the early beginnings of that were in the Jamestown colony, where mixed race people were labeled as abominations and spurious issue. And the Powhatan tribes, Pocahontas people, were being enslaved from the moment those colonists landed in Jamestown. Some of the earlier laws have to do with the enslavement of natives. And when you get into the Racial Purity Act and the one drops and the blood quantums, you know, that's when they finally codified into law the racial classification. But the Americas were extremely diverse by modern, according to modern racialized categories, long before Europeans came here, because it was peopled initially by Africans and Asians, and Melanesians and Polynesians, which were already mixed Africans and Asians.
Then,
right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was just arbitrary. And there were whole families. If you're trying to do genealogical research as an African-American or as a Native, especially as an African-American, you're going to find that your people are classified as so many different things on the census, depending on the year. And whole families, like there's families that some members are white, some members are Black, some members, well, in Virginia, nobody was Native, everybody was colored. So, you know, because it was illegal, literally illegal, to claim that you were Native unless the white people said you were. And there's tribes today that are still dealing with that.
That's
like
true.
the Pamunkey, for example, you know, because they're descendants of Pocahontas, there's actually a thing called the Pocahontas Exception Clause. You can Google that. And where the descendants of Pocahontas are honorary white people.
Then, you know, this leads to this leads to this question then that I'd like to ask, which is because Elaina mentioned that that she believes that some of those indigenous tribes that did hold slaves should also pay reparations to descendants of the Afro-Descendant slaves. What's your what do you agree with that, or respectfully disagree with that? And if you do respectfully disagree with that, explain why.
I don't have really any thoughts about that.
Okay.
Because, you know, I can't speak for all Native people. I can only speak from my experience and what I know and my research and my, identity. And none of the people that I'm related to were engaged in the slave trade. So, I really feel like it's not my place to comment on that.
Okay, Elaina, it's you're going to be the one to host and try to invite us back and then record, because apparently my time is almost up.
Okay.
But as long as they, until they, kick us, until they kick us out,
I do want to say one thing though.
Yes.
There are some people running around saying that Black people are colonists,
Yes.
and that I take issue with that.
Yes, I take issue with it,
And colonizers, and I take issue with that.
And I think they're referring to, the African part of the Afro-descendant here in the United States, well, in the Americas period,